Good evening, everyone. I'm Ken Ruscio, Dean of the Jepson School, and let me welcome all of you to this very special event of the Jepson Forum. Senator McGovern's driver just said that 90 miles an hour was their best friend getting here, so we apologize for the delay. Our topic this year is the state of public debate. And as we thought about the challenges facing leaders these days, and indeed the challenges facing democracy, high among them was the perception and perhaps the reality that our public discourse has become harsh, uncivil, partisan in a detrimental and confrontational way, polarized, and ultimately destructive of the kind of democratic debate so essential in this diverse society. Drawing from their long careers in public life, their own hard-fought battles, their victories and defeats, our guests tonight will undoubtedly have something to say on the subject. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but let me first explain our format for the conversation that we're going to have this evening. First, Senators Dole and McGovern, unaccustomed though they may be to public speaking, will provide some introductory comments for about 10 to 15 minutes each. Then I'll have a series of questions for them, focusing on the climate of political debate these days and the possibility for effective action in the public interest. And then finally, to conclude our conversation, we'll take questions from the audience. But because of the constraints of our setting this evening, I'll ask you to write your questions on the cards that have been provided, and we'll collect them after the senators speak. And while I'm posing my questions to them, some of my colleagues will be sifting through yours, and then we'll ask them on your behalf. So I strongly encourage you to write those questions and be thinking about them as the senators are speaking this evening. Now, a few more pieces of information. Tonight's session is being taped for broadcast on Sunday, February 12th by WCVE 88.9, our local public radio station. And I should also note that the UR Alumni Association is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. We greatly appreciate it. And finally, after our discussion concludes, you'll have the opportunity to meet the senators outside in the foyer, where they'll be pleased to sign the books that you'll undoubtedly want to buy, and which our bookstore has kindly made available for that purpose. Now, to some degree, of course, our guests need no introduction. Anyone who has not slept through the last 50 years of politics in America knows them well, and knows that they have much in common, that they also have a few things not in common, and that their paths have crossed many times throughout their careers, sometimes as adversaries and sometimes as allies. Both are highly decorated World War II veterans. Senator McGovern for his 35 missions flying over Europe, and Senator Dole for his bravery in Italy during the final days of the war when he was severely wounded. Both spent years in the world's greatest deliberative body, with Senator Dole achieving the position of majority leader and Senator McGovern making his name in the areas of foreign affairs and agriculture. Both received their party's nomination for president, McGovern in 1972 and Dole in 1996. And they both acquitted themselves well, but are joining us tonight without Secret Service escorts. The title of one of Senator Dole's latest books is Great Presidential Wit, with the subtitle, I Wish I Was in It. Then there are those differences. Senator McGovern was raised by two staunch Republican parents, while Senator Dole was raised by two firm Democrats. So go figure. In recent years, these two distinguished public servants have joined forces in common cause to end world hunger, even co-authoring a book last year on this important subject. And as Senator McGovern has written in one of his own books, I have no enmity towards conservatives. A treasured and political ally and friend is Senator Bob Dole, a true compassionate conservative and one of our national treasures. My parents, he went on to say, would have regarded my friendship with Bob Dole as the crowning achievement of my political life. Please join me in welcoming both of these national treasures to the university.
Brought the wrong book. Not really. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I know Senator McGovern is very happy to be here. His plane was late, and he missed a connection in Minneapolis, and just now walked in the door. So, George, welcome to Richmond. Had he not been here, I would have gone from this mic. Well, I would have covered all the bases. I could have been Bob Dole, and then I'd be George McGovern. So like this. Dean, thank you very much for those preliminary remarks, and we're not going to speak at length because we want to get into questions. And you did mention one book that I compiled. Actually, we compiled two. One was called Great Political Wit, Laughing Almost All the Way to the White House. And the other was Great Presidential Wit, and the subtitle was I Wish I Was in This Book. But I think in the first book, the best story is one you've probably heard, but I'll tell it anyway. It's a nonpartisan, bipartisan, just a lot of good stories about Democrats, Republicans, and people around the world, like Winston Churchill. And he was having a big dinner one night in London, and Lady Astor was there, and after a while they got to arguing back and forth, and they were really going at it hot and heavy, and she finally turned to him and said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would poison your coffee." He said, "If you were my wife, I would drink it." So, you know. So I always like that little story. I don't know what it's supposed to mean, but if you don't drink coffee, you're all right. But in any event, so that became a bestseller for some reason, and so we started off in this other book, Great Presidential Wit, and we wanted to go way back to George Washington, way up to the present time, and pick out the top 10 presidents who had a sense of humor, who had the best sense, and then on down the line to number 10. Now, some of you may look, I didn't know all the presidents. I didn't know Washington. But Senator Thurman did, and he was a big help to me. He had been an intern for Jefferson and met Washington a couple of times. But anyway, the three or four of us get together and we work on this book, and we go do a lot of research and try to put it together and try to come up with what we think are the top 10, sort of the Letterman top 10. And we ended up with Abraham Lincoln as number 1. And if you think about Lincoln and the Civil War, and he's a tragic-looking figure according to some, and he had all these personal disasters, tragedies in his family, I think he kind of used humor to get from one day to the next. He was speaking one night, and a lady jumped up and said, "Mr. President, you're two-faced." He said, "You think if I had another one, I'd use the one I have?" That was not bad for the 60s, 1860s. But number 2 is one the more recent, and Ronald Reagan. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you kind of like the guy. He had that glint in his eye and smile. He could disarm anybody. And he walked into the room, people about this many people, and said, "Boy, have I been getting a lot of flack lately since I ordered those B-1s. He said, "How was I to know they were airplanes?" He said, "I thought they were vitamins for the troops." That's how Reagan, he just had a way about him. You liked him. And one more in the top 10, that was Calvin Coolidge. Anybody here remember Calvin Coolidge? If you do, you're older than I am. But he never said anything. He was nicknamed Silent Cow. He'd have a press conference, question number 1, no comment, number 2, no comment, number 3, no comment, no comment. And then when he finished, he said, now don't quote me on anything. And he was at a White House dinner one night, and he got about halfway through the dinner, and a senator's wife reached over the table and said, Mr. President, I bet my husband $20 I could get you to say 3 words. He said, you lose. So anyway, that's the way it is. But it is an honor to be here and to be with George McGovern, my friend, and we're here to talk about civility and what's happened to the system, if anything's happened to the system, or do we just hear more about it because there are more channels, more television channels. But there is a feeling that politics today is a bit more partisan or rancorous than it has been in the past. And I can't say that I totally disagree, but there have been some difficult times in Washington before, and this is one of them. Certainly leading up to President Nixon's resignation, it was partisan and difficult. It was also very partisan during many moments in the Reagan years and in the Carter years. And at the height of the Clinton impeachment proceedings, there were a lot of politics back and forth, Democrats and Republicans. Now, some of you think that McGovern and I have been around for all of the presidencies. This is not the case. We only ran 4 or 5 times apiece. We knew most of the presidents, but not all of them. I understand it was really tough during John Adams' day, but George and I were only interns at that time. So I do believe there are a few in Washington, not just on Capitol Hill, but elsewhere, some in the media, others who lead politically active organizations that could take it down a notch, and I can name names, but I won't. I find bipartisanship is much easier when you're out of office. It's easier for me and Senator McGovern to be bipartisan because we don't vote on anything. At least I don't think we do. We're not allowed. My wife votes for me, but in any event. And we can disagree on issues, but it doesn't mean that we're enemies. The emphasis needs to be made by our leaders that our differences are not so great that we have to hate the other person or the other party. When I ran against President Clinton, I said he was my opponent, not my enemy. And that's the way it was. I mean, he wasn't my enemy. I didn't hate the man. I wanted to win. He wanted to win. And he did win. And that was it. But we all believe in freedom and liberty for everyone. We may have important differences in how we get there, but it's no reason to deviate from civil discourse. In truth, the way to mitigate the animosity is to refocus on respect for others, recognize there are different viewpoints, and I can think of only a few characters in my career who maybe, in my view, did not deserve respect. But for the sake of the country, we do need to maintain decency in public life. Long before I came to Congress, the policy was always to be very deferential toward others. My parents taught me that. You would refer in the Congress to my honorable colleague and my esteemed colleague. Now they refer to him as esteemed colleague. But however, below the surface, I sense it really hasn't changed that much. We can always sit on the outside and find something wrong. But there are still a lot of people on Capitol Hill and both parties trying to work together. And I don't pretend to have the solution, but I know if I were there, I would take this position. I would get 10 of the leaders in a room and say, you just can't be against everything. If you don't like this, what are you going to offer? And I say that as far as both parties are concerned. And I will close by saying some of the young people who are here tonight, you have your whole lives ahead of you. You're living at a great time, and you all do things with computers and technology that I will never understand. You also face challenges as a generation that you will need to rise up, just as George and my generation did 6 decades ago. And I would encourage you, above all, to live by basic values. I mean, values are important, and they don't age. Honesty and integrity and accountability, honor, duty, country, all the things we talk about are important. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, but we always hope the next generation will do better. And I had the opportunity tonight to meet a number of young students, university, and they're the future leaders. They're the future members of Congress or city council or labor leaders or CEOs in business or whatever it might be. And so they have a great responsibility. So we're here tonight to demonstrate that Republicans and Democrats, as I said, it's easier when you're out of office, but we got along pretty well when we were in office. And it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, George McGovern.
Well, I'm especially happy to be at the University of Richmond tonight. It looked pretty grim in Minneapolis today when we missed our connection by an hour and a half. But thanks to the driving skill of one Chris, Chris, who drove me here tonight, Chris Dorval, I'm going to return the favor to him. I'm a friend of Joe Gibbs, the coach of the Washington Redskins, but he also runs racing cars. And I've promised Chris Dorval that I will write a good letter of recommendation to him. But I am glad to be in this historically rich city. My little hometown newspaper, the Mitchell Daily Republic, informed us in this morning's issue that February 6th is a historic date. It's the birth date of President Ronald Reagan that Bob has already mentioned. It was also on this same day, February 6th in 1895, when Babe Ruth was born in Baltimore, and today is Zsa Zsa Gabor's 89th birthday. So with that scholarly grounding in history, I will begin on the decline of civil discourse in American politics. Let me just say that at the outset, what a pleasure it always is to share the platform with my longtime colleague and treasured friend, Bob Dole, one of the most civil and admirable men in American politics. Do I think he is always right? Not on your life. Neither does he think I'm always right. He's a proud conservative Republican, as were my mother and father. I'm a proud liberal Democrat, as were Bob's parents. So much for the influence of parents. But Bob Dole has three qualities I admire, and you've already seen the first of those tonight, and that is a sparkling sense of humor. Bob has the capacity to see humor in everything from the White House to the wonder drug Viagra. After the late President Nixon, he says no free samples. After the late President Nixon was forced to resign the office, shortly thereafter, he and former Presidents Ford and Carter all attended President Sadats' funeral in Cairo, Egypt. And Bob looked at that picture of these three former presidents and he said, see no evil, hear no evil, and evil. Now keep in mind, no mention of anyone's name. Bob is not a name caller. He's a civil tongue. Bob, I didn't always agree with the old Southern Democratic senators that you and I served with so long. But I think one of the things we have in common, we both enjoyed the jokes and the stories of these elderly Southern Democrats. As I said, we didn't always agree with them. In some respects, they were more conservative than either of us. But I remember one incident when the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee of this state, Willis Robertson, father of the television evangelist Pat Robertson, he was asked one day in a Senate debate by another senator why a bill he had sponsored with high hopes a couple of years earlier had borne so little fruit. And Senator Robertson says, well, that reminds me of the old Georgia colonel during debate in the Georgia state legislature as to whether Georgia had the strength with the help of other southern states to defeat the Union forces. And the colonel finished a fiery speech by saying, we can beat those damn Yankees with corn stalks. Well, 4 years later, after Sherman's march to the sea across Georgia, one of the young legislators said, Colonel, I thought you told us we could defeat those Yankees with corn stalks. Senator Robertson tells the story. The colonel looked at him for a moment. He says, the damn Yankees wouldn't fight with corn stalks. All of you know about Senator Sam Ervin, the great senator from North Carolina who conducted the investigation of the Watergate matter. He came to a Democratic of the Senate one day, and Mike Mansfield, the majority leader, was presiding. And Sam had some project, some kind of raid on the Treasury for North Carolina, and he was making an eloquent speech, and Mike Mansfield asked him one of those questions where no matter how you answer it, you're going to be in trouble. And so he said, you know, Mike, you remind me of the old boy down in my hometown, North Carolina. He was a Baptist minister, and he was teaching a class of Sunday school boys. He said, today we're going to talk about the creation story. God created Adam, took a rib out of his side, created Eve, and from this union came two sons, Cain and Abel, and so the human family evolved from that point on. The boy in the back of the room, Reverend, where did Cain and Abel get their wives? The old minister frowned for a minute. He says, you know, young man, it's impertinent questions like that that's hurting religion. I could go on with lots of other stories. I think it's possible to have a civil discourse with somebody without a sense of humor, but sure a whale of a lot of energy, a lot easier to do it with somebody like Bob, who not only sees the humorous side of much of the human condition, but is also capable of poking fun at himself. So humor, I think, is a precondition of civil discourse. I've been amazed many times how quickly it relaxed the tensions in the Senate and outside the Senate when you have somebody that can pull a quip. The second foundation stone, as I see it, a civil discourse, is also something that Bob Dole has in great abundance, and that is the willingness to stand by your convictions, even when the wind may be blowing in the other direction. And you can do that, you can hold to those convictions while respecting the differing views of your opponent. I've never known Bob to hold his finger up in the wind to see which way it was blowing and then take a position that otherwise he wouldn't hold. We differed in 1972 over the war in Vietnam, perhaps the most divisive war in our history since the Civil War. I was the Democratic candidate for president that year. I probably wouldn't have run from a little state like South Dakota with only 3 electoral votes had it not been for the strong feeling I had that this war was not in the interest of the United States. Bob was then the Republican National Chairman and a United States Senator, highly respected. He had a different view. I never once attributed anything other than sincerity and conviction to Bob. And let me say this to you. He was tempted many times by some of the people around him to imply that there was something wrong with my loyalty and my patriotism, that I wasn't willing to support the war in Vietnam. Let me be clear on one thing. I never once criticized an American soldier who fought in that war. They were just as brave and just as committed as they were in any war we've ever fought. And they fought well, as American soldiers always done, but not once did Bob Dole ever imply there was anything other than sincerity behind my convictions, even though he disagreed with them. The other thing I want to say about that is that, like Bob, I haven't hesitated to criticize leaders of my own party as well as Republican leaders when I thought they were wrong, including the Democratic Secretary of Defense in the Johnson administration, Bob McNamara, who now says, in his opinion, the war was a tragic mistake. Bob was in Italy during World War II, as I was. I was flying bombing missions over Nazi Germany. He was with the American Army Ski Patrol and was savagely wounded in that conflict while trying to take care of his own men. The war for me and other people in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, not for Bob. He was in hospitals for the next 3.5 years fighting for his life, still doesn't have much use of his right arm. So I admire that kind of integrity, and I'm glad to say that Bob's had some kind words to say about me, which I treasure. We've teamed up together on a number of things, and one of them I want to mention here just quickly tonight, and that is an international school lunch program. In this country, that program was started by Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who was chairman of the Armed Service Committee and discovered that in World War II, about 30% of the young men called for the draft were declared ineligible because of physical ailments or handicaps of one kind or another, many of them resulting from malnutrition in their youthful years. So as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, one of the first things Senator Russell did after World War II, with the help of Senator Ellender of Louisiana, was to sponsor the first federal school lunch program It's a wonderful program. The dean of the University of Georgia once told me that that program had done more to lift the development of Georgia than any other federal program. I said, well, now, Dean, that takes in a lot of territory. That includes Social Security and the REAs and minimum wages, all these other things, the TVA. He said, those are important, but I stand on what I said. As we enriched the nutritional health of the young people growing up in this state, it took on a whole new face in stimulating the development of Georgia. How do you think we produce these winning football teams down here in the South all the time? So when I got the idea here a few years ago that we ought to persuade the United Nations, with the United States in the lead, to create an international school lunch program for the 300 million school-age kids now getting nothing to eat during the school day in Asia, Africa, Latin America, parts of the Middle East. Bob Dole was the first one that signed on as the co-sponsor of that idea. Today we have school lunches going on a pilot basis in 38 different countries. It literally transforms the lives of those little children. Let me just tell you one thing. A school lunch is the best magnet to pull a poor, underfed child into school. It actually doubles the enrollment in places like Africa when you start one of these programs. Secondly, the academic performance goes up. And thirdly, and I'd ask you to remember this, sometimes Bob and I are told, you can't get on top of this hunger problem until you hold down the population rate. Well, what we've found in researches that have been conducted is that of that 300 million children who get nothing to eat during the school day, most of those who don't go to school, some 120 million, are girls because of the favoritism towards us males in most society. But if they go to school, even for 6 years, grades 1 through 6, they marry later in life, unlike their little illiterate friends at home who start getting married at 11, 12, 13 years of age and have an average of 6 children. The ones who have elementary education for 6 years marry later in life. They know a little bit more about what the alternatives are in life. They're not as easy to push around by boys and men. They have an average of 2.9 children. So those who worry about population outstripping food supply should recognize that on the strength of these school lunches that pull the girls into school as well as the boys, you cut the birth rate in half. And I'm deeply honored that Bob stands shoulder to shoulder with me on this effort. You know, I used to say when the subject of aging came up, well, it's not so vital how long you live, it's what you do with the years you have. Now that I'm 83, I don't say that anymore. I want to live to be 100. And you know why? One reason is that I think it might take another 17 years for us to reach all these 300 million school children out there who are dying too young, who are handicapped mentally and physically by malnutrition. I want to do for them what Senator Russell, Senator Ellender, and others did with overwhelming support in the Congress for youngsters in this country. So that's the second thing that I admire about Bob, is that he stands up for things like that. He's a conservative, but as I tell people all over this country, he's a genuine, compassionate conservative. If you lay in a hospital for 3.5 years fighting for your life, you're going to be a little more compassionate to other people that have trouble. So I salute you again on that, Bob. The third thing, and I'm just going to say this in one sentence because I'm taking too much time. I think to have a real civil discourse in this country, you have to have people on both sides of the major issues who honestly try to put the national interest first, to try to do what is in the public interest, not in the interest of some special group with a lot of money and favors to give away. I think Abraham Lincoln, if I could talk about him in conclusion, maybe stated some of these things about civil discourse the best. As the Civil War ground to a bloody conclusion, here's what he said in his second inaugural. Neither party, meaning neither North nor South, expected the war of this magnitude or duration. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each side looked for an easier triumph and a result fundamental and astounding. Then listen to this. Both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Then he adds, the prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully, but the Almighty has his own purposes. And then in his first inaugural, as the war clouds were beginning, Lincoln said this, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Isn't that a great phrase? I wish I'd have thought of that. The better angels of our nation. I believe the better angels of our nature can help restore a civil discourse to American politics, to this country that we all love. And Bob Dole, thanks for being always the good and decent public servant that has served both you and the nation so magnificently.
Well, now's the time for all of you to begin writing your questions if you haven't already, and I'll wait about a minute or two before we ask some of our students in the back to come by and collect them. So let me pose the first question to our two guests this evening, and then we'll take a minute and collect them, and I'll ask a few more questions, and then we'll get right to your questions. But I would like to first thank both of you very much for just the model that you have presented to, if nothing else, a skeptical student generation these days about the possibility really for civil discourse and disagreement at the same time. So thank you very, very much, and I'm sure we'll have some follow-ups on that as well. I would like to start, though, by asking both of you maybe to reflect on a couple of things that you have been a part of in history. And you both mentioned the 1972 campaign, which was you know, I think by most measures, a very, very divisive time in our country and a very polarized time. And I guess I would like to hear both of you maybe reflect upon how that was different, if it was different, from the sense of polarization and partisanship that we feel today. Can you compare those two times?
72 and...
72 and today. More divisive, less divisive, divisive in a different way?
I think maybe divisive in a different way, and George would know better because he was right out in the firing line. But, you know, as I said in my preliminary remarks, I've been out of the Senate now almost 10 years. Senator McGovern been out longer than that. And it's pretty hard for us to sit in judgment of what's happening today. It seems to be more rancorous. There seems to be more 24/7 politics, everything politics, whether it's judge nominations or whatever it might be. And I think there's some fault in both parties. But I don't think it's nearly as bad as it was in 1972, in a different way. Now, George would know more specifically.
I do think the Vietnam War was probably as divisive as anything that has happened in this country, at least during the years that I've been in politics. And that campaign of 72 produced the Watergate cover-up, which may or may not be more serious than some of the things that have happened since then. I do think the House and the Senate reached the right bipartisan conclusion in asking President Nixon to step down. But I will say this about Nixon. His administration was not entirely a failure. He opened the doors to China, which no previous president had done. He established a policy of peaceful coexistence with the Russians. It was called détente, which was a remarkable achievement. He started the Environmental Protection Agency, and he signed all those food assistance bills that Bob and I kept sending over to the White House. We doubled the food stamp program. I say we, it was a bipartisan effort, and it came out of our committee. It got to the point where when senators would come to the floor and ask what the vote was, they'd say, well, it's the Dole-McGovern amendment or the McGovern-Dole amendment, as we say in South Dakota. Once they heard that combination, it was just almost automatically going to pass. So we virtually doubled the school lunch program. We started the WIC program, stands for Women, Infants, and Children, low-income, pregnant, and nursing mothers and their infants through the age of 5. So even at that time, with the turmoil over Watergate, first the resignation of Vice President Agnew and then President Nixon, nonetheless, a lot of national business got done. I'm a little more concerned about the situation we're in today. Just to keep all of these things somewhat in perspective, I'm an old history teacher. I won't give you any more Zsa Zsa Gabor references, but this business of lambasting your opponent, even underhanded jabs, is nothing new in American politics. In the 1800s, there was a bitterly fought presidential race between President John Adams, the conservative Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the more liberal candidate in what was then called the Republican Party. But that campaign really hit a I think almost an all-time low. The Federalists accused Jefferson, who's always been one of my heroes, as an atheist. They said that if he were elected, he would confiscate the Bibles in the country. and numerous old people were hiding their Bibles in the well or under the mattress. One Federalist orator, it was too much even for this Federalist candidate, John Adams. He said, "With Jefferson in the White House, French armies will march in the streets of America." That was too much for John Adams, even though it was supposed to be helping him. Bob knows that sometimes your friends think they're helping you when they're digging your grave. But in any event, in that particular situation, John Adams exploded. He said, "Look, I no more expect to see a French army in America with or without Jefferson than I do in heaven." And so we've had some pretty tough punches going on in American politics for a long time.
Well,
the follow on there, George mentioned Watergate, just in passing, and I was chairman of the Republican National Committee at the time, and the Democrats thought the burglary tools were hidden in my apartment. In fact, a reporter named Joe Lasselik from the Kansas City Star came to ask me. He said, "I hate to ask you this question, but are the burglary tools hidden in your apartment?" Because I lived in the Watergate, only about 150 yards from where the burglary took place. And I said, "No, Joe, that was my night off. I was on a job in Chicago." But the Watergate's a very famous place because my next door neighbor, after the election in '96, I lost, in case it hadn't trickled down yet, but we'd gone to bed early one night, and about 30 minutes later, there were lights all over the Watergate, the front door, the side door, the back door, the garage door, and I said, "Elizabeth, there's been a recount." But it turned out they discovered that Monica Lewinsky lived right next door to us in the Watergate. And I must confess, I never realized all the potential for excitement right there in the neighborhood.
I might just observe that Bob not only picks interesting neighbors, but he has a good sense of timing. After that '72 election, and just before the Watergate thing broke, he stepped down as National Republican chairman. And lo and behold, George Bush Sr. became the Republican chairman, and his counterpart, the Democratic chairman, Bob Strauss of Texas, said to him, "Well, George, I think you got a real bear by the tail." Turned out to be right.
This is the easiest job in the world for me. Let me, I want to go back to another incident in history that you both were a part of, and it's a happy story. And it's the 1986 Tax Reform Act.
Which one?
Which tax reform?
The Tax Reform Act of 1986 that you shepherded through and is noted as one of the most bipartisan efforts ever to come out of the Senate in recent times. And it really was a very difficult bill to pass in the face of a lot of special interest. And I think at one point in that debate, you sent up a note to the Republican leadership in the White House saying, "I don't know if this is a good thing or not for you, but I support the legislation," and actually caused turmoil in the White House about whether they should announce your support or not. But Senator Dole, that was quite an achievement, and you did play a central role. And I wondered if there are lessons that you took from that are applicable to today's political scene.
Well, I think it's give and take. It's like anything else. Not like everything else, it's politics, but I mean, you have to, you learn patience, you learn to listen to your colleagues, you learn to adapt, you learn to keep your word. The word's all you have. Your words is our currency in our life when we were in politics. And if I promised Senator McGovern he could offer an amendment tomorrow and then reneged and let some Republican offer an amendment, I'm finished. My credibility is gone. And so it took a lot of give and take and a lot of night meetings, and I think we were on the floor nearly all night. We had some very tough amendments, tough things, but we were trying to reduce taxes at the same time trying to close loopholes. And there were giant loopholes where people didn't pay any taxes. Some big corporations didn't pay any taxes. We didn't think that was quite what the founding fathers had in mind, or when the income tax was passed and the amendment was adopted. But in any event, it's just a case of sitting there and understanding and putting it together and getting a majority. I'm not certain what the vote was out of the committee, but I think it was fairly broad bipartisan vote. But I think the proudest moment of George may have his was in 1983 with working with Senator Moynihan, a Democrat from New York, to sort of rescue Social Security. It was about to go belly up, and there were 30 million seniors wonder where their checks were going to come from because we didn't get something passed in several months. The checks would be late, which amounts to a reduction. And we had what we called the Greenspan Commission. Mr. Greenspan just stepped down 2 days ago as the Fed chairman. But the commission sort of evaporated, and Pat and I got together and said, we can't let this happen. There are too many people, including my mother, who will be after me if this happens. So I think there are certain things that you do, but I've always found if it's going to last, you need bipartisan support. You need people on both sides of the aisle, sort of the center, call it the center, to come together and support the legislation. Doesn't mean that if you've got a big margin, if you pass legislation, it's not good, but I've always, in my experience, if you had compromise and Democrats and Republicans voting for the certain measure, it's going to stay. It's going to last.
Over the course of your careers, could you reflect upon how the role of politics in the media have changed? How the media covers politics, how they cover public officials. A lot of people will, as I think you mentioned, Senator, in your remarks, have pointed to the press as one of the culprits in the decline of civility. But I wonder how you think it might have changed over the last 30 or 40 years.
I think it's become considerably more powerful and influential in shaping public opinion. One would hope that reporters for the newspapers and for the television and radio stations would always attempt to be objective and fair-minded in their coverage. It's obvious that that's not always true. Each side probably imagines the press is more on the other side. I've never known a politician who didn't have a few times when they were highly irritated with the way things they were trying to do were portrayed in the press. But having said that, it's probably a fact that the American press is as good as any in the world. Sometimes we think that they're a little too sensational in the way they cover the news, but you go to London, staid old city that's been there for a long time, and there's lurid, sensational stories on the front pages of every paper in London, even the good gray London Times. So the press coverage is going to be what you would expect. It's going to have some human errors. It's going to be overdone. And then when you magnify that with the enormous increase in spending by candidates for high office. The first time I ran for Congress in South Dakota, I had over half the state in my district I ran that campaign for $12,000. I was running in a Republican state in the face of President Eisenhower's re-election at the head of the Republic. Figured I still won on $12,000. Today, in that same district, $1 million would be commonplace in both parties. Tom Daschle, formerly Bob's counterpart, as leader in the Senate, was defeated in South Dakota in 2004. He and his opponent each spent around roughly $20 million. That South Dakota Senate race may have been the most expensive Senate race per capita in the history of the Republic. Do you think that's true, Bob?
Well, I spent $19,000 in my first race, and I had an opponent named Doyle, D-O-Y-L-E. And a lot of people didn't know Dole or Doyle, either one. So I served Dole pineapple juice all over the district. We had dolls for Dole. If I had dolls for Dole now, I'd be locked up for harassment or something. We had a covered wagon and the bobolinks and the bobettes, and we had a lot of fun. And just a few of my campaigners never seemed to tire, and they just always were having fun and laughing and carrying on. I learned later they were lacing their pineapple juice with vodka, but anyway.
This mention by Bob of the Dole and Doyle race reminds me of my first election to the United States Senate. I ran against a fellow who had the wonderful name Bottom, Joe Bottom, and promptly buttons started flaring up all over the state. Vote for McGovern. McGovern is tops. So we used tops against the Bottom, and it took a recount to win, but finally a month after the election, I squeaked through.
Senator McGovern, you have spoken eloquently this evening of your commitment to addressing the problem of world hunger that Senator Dole shares with you. And both of you have written about your commitment in terms that draw upon your faith. And I wondered if you might give us your thoughts about the role that religion and religious beliefs play in, or should play, in public life these days.
I think there has to be a moral and ethical underpinning in politics. Politics is a very hazardous undertaking if you don't have some kind of grounding in the moral law, what the founding fathers sometimes called the natural law. Sometimes they use those things interchangeably, the moral law and the natural law. But if you're not guided by some base foundation of ethical and moral principle, I think you're skating on thin ice to go into politics. Everybody that gets in trouble in politics is not necessarily bad, but in all too many cases, there's a moral failing at the bottom of people who get in the most embarrassing difficulties in politics. I think on this hunger issue, every religion in the world teaches its adherents to feed the hungry. Christ has that famous line, "Inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, you've done it unto me." On another occasion, he asked his followers how they could love God whom they have not seen, if they are unable to love their fellow humans whom they have seen. I believe that. I think that compassion for the poor and the handicapped, the sick, the homeless. The way so many people around the world live is an important part of our political life. If I could just tell one little story about how I first got interested in this hunger issue that has stayed with me ever since. It was in World War II. As I said earlier, Bob and I were both in Italy at that time. I came in on a troop ship into Naples Harbor one beautiful summer day in the summer of 1944. And as we pulled towards the dock, you could see several hundred children on either side of that docking area, and they were yelling to us. After a while, you could hear in broken English, Babe Ruth, Butterfingers, Milky Way, and so on. At that point, the captain of the ship broke in over the loudspeaker. He said, "Do not throw anything to those children on the docks there. This is war-torn Italy. Those children are at the edge of starvation." Yesterday, a troop ship came in here and the GIs started throwing candy bars and chewing gum. Some of it fell in the water, and 25 children drowned fighting for those scraps of food. I watched that situation in Italy, as I'm sure Bob did. We'd wake up sometimes to young mothers scratching through our garbage dump looking for bits of food to take home to their children. Sometimes you'd see the same young women on the streets that night selling themselves for a few dollars to keep their children alive. So since then, I have placed that high on the list of priorities, and always with the help and cooperation of Bob.
I think George is right. I mean, you just have to make that distinction between what's political and what's, when you step over the line. And then I think as George indicated, in this hunger program, we've got every religious group we can think of working on it with us, not, we're working together. And it's a great resource. So I think I think it can be abused. If you use the church as a political forum, unless, certain guidelines.
Senator McGovern just leaned over and mentioned that there is a book that both senators have co-authored, and I believe we have some of those available afterwards for purchase. I'm going to reserve for myself the very last question of the evening, but I think what we'll do now is turn to my two colleagues, Tom Wren and Doug Hicks, who have gone through some of your questions and see what's on your mind. So, Doug, if you would like to pose
Give us a multiple choice.
Multiple choice. We have several true false, I believe. Would that be right?
Senator Dole, Senator McGovern, thank you very much. These are definitely essay questions. I'll just start with a question on the Senate confirmation hearings of the Supreme Court justices. We have a number of those. Has the Senate behaved appropriately in the recent Supreme Court nominees' hearings? Senator McGovern, in your Senate, would a nominee like Judge Alito have received a vast majority of the Democratic votes, including your own? What has changed, and what does this portend for future nominees when the Senate may be controlled by the opposite party from the presidency?
Yeah. Well, I think the hearings have been quite civil. Obviously, there have been criticisms raised of the judges that have been proposed so far. That's always true. They're always going to be vigorously interrogated, and senators are going to have their staffs researching the principal decisions and the legal background of anybody that is confirmed to the Supreme Court, and I think that's as it should be. This is a job, after all, that you get for life. it's very important to the life of the country that we get the best possible people on the court. And I think most senators take that duty conscientiously. I don't think they're just trying to spite the president by rejecting his appointees. As a matter of fact, the record of confirmations is as good under the present administration as it was under the Clinton administration. I'm talking not only about Supreme Court justices, but judges across the whole federal inspection. We are a tripartite system of government, executive, legislative, and judiciary, and the only ones that are for life are the federal judges. So I think it's important that they be vigorously examined by the Senate. The President has the right to appoint, to nominate. The Senate has the right to confirm or deny confirmation.
I think very quickly, I think therein lies what we're here talking about. It means that everything political all the time. I was the Republican leader for 12 years, and when Justice Ginsburg was nominated by President Clinton, he calls me up and says, you know, Bob, I'm going to send up Justice Ginsburg, or she wasn't Justice then, Mrs. Ginsburg. And I said, well, you're the president. You have that right. I don't agree with her philosophy, but we'll try to expedite it. We did expedite it. There was no talk of a filibuster. She received 98 votes, 98 to 2. So then he calls me a little later and says, I'm going to send up Justice Breyer, who'd worked for Ted Kennedy, which gives you a hint of his politics. And I said, well, you know, I know Mr. Breyer. He's a very fine man. I said, I know he's very liberal philosophy, but, you know, again, you're the president. You make the nominations, and it's our duty to advise and consent, not to filibuster or try to do all these other things, make your wife cry and things like that. But so we did that one, and the vote was 96 to 2. I think it was 96 to 2. And I think maybe George and I and maybe some other old graybeards, you know, need to figure out some way we can help Democrats and Republicans now. I mean, it's just too much politics. That's the one fault I find with it. Everything is up for grabs. Everything is political. Everything is like a jump ball. And it shouldn't be that way. I mean, in the Alito nomination, he was got the highest rating you can get from the American Bar Association, well qualified, the highest rating you can get from lawyers. We generally don't rate the Republican nominees too high, but he was well qualified. And I thought he should have had many more votes, and I believe if Senator McGovern had been there, had this happened when we were in the Senate, no question about it, I think the vote would have probably been unanimous. If anybody here want to be a judge, well, let me know.
Not just because we're getting older, but I think there is something to be said about consulting older people. There's a notion in some quarters that as you get older, all you observe is a kind of a drag on society. The Washington Post had an editorial here a while back saying what a calamity it is that Americans are living longer. It's a drain on the Treasury. It's a burden on young people. I don't know whether they'll still write those editorials when they themselves are a little older. But I think Bob Dole is a wiser, more thoughtful person today than when I first knew him back in his days in the House or when he first came to the Senate. I'd like to think I've learned a little since I've been around a considerable period of time. It doesn't hurt sometimes to check with older heads, I think. I come from a state that we're speaking here now as two people that didn't follow the lead of our parents, but we did pick up a sense of the importance of decency and morality and tolerance to the other point of view. I've often thought about Lyndon Johnson. All the while he was in the Senate as majority leader and in other roles, he knew that he was limited in his knowledge of foreign affairs. He was a genius on domestic politics, put through one measure after another, more effective than his predecessor, John Kennedy. But when it came to foreign policy, he was uncertain. So when he was in the Senate, he would talk to Senator Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or Senator Mansfield of Montana, former professor of American history. Or he'd talk to George Aiken, the old Republican senator from Vermont. But when he got down there to the White House, he inherited this young White House staff, these brain trusters from Harvard and Yale and Michigan and elsewhere, and they led him down the path on foreign policy. I've always wished that he had gone to Mike Mansfield, his old friend, and George Aiken, and Senator Fulbright, Senator Greening, Senator Morris. We might not have thrown our army into that jungle in Southeast Asia. And here again in this Iraq war, I don't know what you folks think about it, but I wish that President Bush had talked to his father before he sent the American army into Iraq. I wish he'd talked to Jim Baker, his father's Secretary of State, or to General Scowcroft, his father's National Security Advisor. I don't know what they would have said, but I have good reason to think they wouldn't have encouraged the sending of the American army into that Arabian desert. But those are just some of the things that
I don't know how we got over on that subject, but
I got
Senators.
inspired.
Excuse me, Senators, we had a whole pile of questions on Iraq, and I'll widen the question and ask you about foreign policy. Is it, in general terms, is it easier or more difficult to have civil public discourse about foreign policy than about domestic affairs?
Is it easier to have civil discourse about foreign policy or domestic policy?
I think it's about I think it's about the same. I mean, it's different. I mean, you're talking about different things, but you can have very sharp differences on foreign policy debate as much as you can have on whether it's food stamps or Medicare Part D, which we ought to talk about tonight. Maybe a few people eligible here, but there will be before we finish. So I don't see any great difference. I'm just trying to think of some example, but I don't think of one. Vietnam foreign policy, the debate couldn't have been any more divisive, bitter debate. I mean, Senator McGovern knows he was on one side. I was on the other side, but he even talked me into voting for one of his amendments, the Cooper Church. I was supposed to oppose it, but I ended up voting for it. And then I heard from the Nixon White House right away. But anyway, I think they're about the same.
You know, we went through a period of time right after World War II when we had what was called the bipartisan foreign policy. And the theory there was that politics should stop at the water's edge I'm not sure that's right. I think we need to debate these issues of war and peace intensively. Now, obviously, if there's a sudden attack like there was at Pearl Harbor, we're going to go after the country that did it. But most of these conflicts that we've become involved in, I think there's been ample time to take extended investigation, committee hearings, investigations, vigorous debate on the Senate floor. It doesn't necessarily have to be between Republicans and Democrats. It might be between divisions within those two parties, as there was in the case of Vietnam. But I'm still an advocate of carefully examining the questions, whether they're important domestic questions or important foreign policy questions. I was always disappointed that President Nixon would not agree to debates in the 72 presidential campaign. I don't think that was because he wanted to avoid partisanship. I think he wanted to avoid George McGovern. And I don't say that I'm the world's greatest debater, but I think we'd have had a better, more balanced campaign. I even think the results would have been closer if we'd have had a series of 3 televised debates, which has become standard in this country. And I think the same thing goes for important decisions on the Senate floor.
Maybe one more question, Doug, from the audience.
Okay. There were a number of questions on Iran and U.S. and UN policy towards Iran. So the general question would be, how do we engage in international debate when some countries' actions appear not only uncivil, but belligerent? What role can civility play when the other participants may not be interested in civility?
Well, Iran is a big country. It's about the size of Alaska, 70 million people. I think 60% of those are under 30 years of age. And in my view, we ought to be getting information to these younger people in Iran. We've got a real problem there. I mean, they can be a real threat, and they've got this lunatic as president. I can't pronounce his name, but I can pronounce lunatic. He's already started up their nuclear plans again, but again, we're going to toss it over to the Security Council. But the question is, when it gets there, will China and Russia, cooperate so we can maybe impose sanctions or do something? The last thing we want is a military confrontation. We're spread pretty thin right now, and we don't need another one. But we don't need all the young people, I made it or not, we don't need to make it safer for their lives. And I think Iran is a big, big, big threat. When you can get France and Germany to vote with us, there's something cooking out there. I mean, I was so pleased I started drinking French water again.
Senator.
Oh, this is French, isn't it?
Bob, you remember when you remember when the French wouldn't help us on the war on terror, that the House of Representatives voted to take French fries off the dining room menu over there. I've worried about that. I asked if next we'd have to tear down the Statue of Liberty, which the French give us, even give up the French kiss, which would have
Well, they even had the story, George, how many people does it take to defend Paris? And it said, I don't know, it's never been tried.
Well, I think on I think on the question on Iran, it is a serious matter. I wonder if it wasn't a mistake for the president, who doubtless was doing what he thought was best, to early in his administration put Iraq, Iran, and North Korea on the list of the axis of evil. What that did, it seems to me, was to serve notice on those three countries for the whole world to hear that we had them in our sights, our gun sights, and that we wouldn't tolerate any wrongdoing. But it also meant that when we carried out that threat and went after Iraq, after Saddam Hussein, that the other two must have been thinking they're serious about this. We're on that axis of evil, and so North Korea's leaders may well have thought, well, one way to keep the Americans out of here is to have at least one nuclear weapon. We have even one, which would be capable of killing the whole American army if we invaded. Maybe they'll leave us alone. I don't know what goes on in the heads of the North Koreans because we don't recognize them. We have no embassy there, no representation. And the same is now true with Iran. I've always thought it was a mistake to close our embassies because we don't like the conduct of a particular government, whether it's Cuba or Iran or North Korea or whatever. And I was glad when former President Jimmy Carter went to North Korea. And he came back and said, look, we talk about them as being monsters, but I found a lot of people in the government and across the whole spectrum who seemed to me like rather ordinary human beings that we're capable of dealing with. You know, in the 1980s, we tilted towards Iraq because we thought they were the best barrier to the spread of Iranian power into the Persian Gulf area where the oil is. You have to be careful, I think, in foreign policy not to needlessly arouse fears, to needlessly arouse resentment, sometimes hatred to the point where it turns back on us. So I think we ought to not be too quick to invoke sanctions on Iran or to refuse to talk to them on a one-on-one basis. I know we try to talk them through the British and the French, sometimes the Russians, but it might be in our self-interest as a nation to keep the lines of communication open even to countries that we're afraid of. It's just possible that you might get a breakthrough. I think that's what President Nixon did when he went to communist China and opened up the doors. Nobody now thinks China's going to go to war with the United States. They might take our trade away from us, but I don't think we really expect that they're any longer a military superpower bent on the destruction of the United States. And the same with Russia. There again, President Nixon, perhaps better than any other president since Roosevelt, kept the doors open to Russia. So I have come down on the side of caution about the measures we take against countries that we're either afraid of or worried about what they might do in the future. We need to be well prepared, of course, that goes without saying. Anyway, thanks for all these good questions.
Okay.
Could I just say I don't agree with that?
Well, I did want to reserve my the privilege of chair for the very last question, and it's this. I mean, both of you are outstanding leaders. You're both effective politicians. What do you say to young people today who say that in order to be a good leader, you can't be a good politician, and that good politicians cannot be good leaders?
Well, to pick up on what Bob just said, I disagree with that. I can't be a good leader and be a good politician. It's not easy to win an election in this country. Usually the competition is very tough. The year I ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, I had to defeat 16 other candidates, some of them very tough. Hubert Humphrey, my lifetime friend, Ed Muskie, John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina. The list went on and on. You have to exercise some political skill to win a nomination like that. I know that I was snowed under by Nixon in the general election, but I think about the coach of the Buffalo Bills who took his team to the Super Bowl 4 straight times and lost all 4 Super Bowls. Somebody said to Coach Levy, isn't it embarrassing to lose 4 straight Super Bowls? Coach Levy says, yeah, it's embarrassing. Do you want to know how to avoid that kind of embarrassment? Just don't be good enough to get to the Super Bowl. I've always liked that. I got to the Super Bowl, and so did Bob. We both lost, but we didn't win those nominations without exercising a considerable amount of political skill. I myself, even though Bob has just said he mistakenly disagrees with me on this foreign policy question, I wish he were in the White House right now. Thank you.
First, I want to say hello to Elizabeth Carter. Is she here? She's not here. Anyway, and she worked in the Dole Institute, it's a little place we have out at the University of Kansas. I think she's a student here. But anyway, you know, the word politician doesn't resonate very well with a lot of people. Oh, just another politician. I mean, I can hear these people saying, you got to stop being a politician and be a statesman. That's generally after you've passed on that you become a statesman. But I think you really have to, the one thing you have to be able to do in politics is to listen. And sometimes when you get there, you're so busy talking, you forget to listen. And the people at home, whether they're in Richmond or where they may be, you know, might like to talk to you. I always discern that every election year, my hearing improved. I heard these voices in Kansas that I hadn't heard for 6 years. And I'm certain that's true with others. Not that you weren't busy and you weren't trying to do what you were supposed to do. So I don't know, I think a politician, in the right sense of the word, is a very high level, I don't know, attractive in a sense, goal for a young person. Get in a campaign, get into somebody's campaign, running for city council or Congress or whatever. You meet a lot of great people. You may not all agree with you on everything, but you meet a lot of nice people. And I remember running for president, I can't remember which time. I think it was W.C. Field said, try again, then give up. No use making a damn fool of yourself. But I think all during that campaign, I only had, maybe George should say the same, only I think 2 people wouldn't shake hands with me. You know, people they were just that strong on the other side. They didn't want any to even touch a Republican. And but anyway, I wonder if I could ask, are there any World War II veterans here? Would you please stand so we give you a nice round of applause, you guys? because if it weren't for you, the rest of us wouldn't be here. And we appreciate that. And you got a couple of World War II vets up here. We lose 1,500 a day. We're down to 5 million from 16.5 million. And if you haven't been up to see the memorial yet, you got to do that. It's a wonderful, wonderful place, and it's built not with federal funds, with private funds. $195 million was raised to build that, and you'd be proud of it. But and we thank all the others who served their country too. But I want to especially point out the World War II vets. We were called the greatest generation. Now we're sort of the disappearing generation. And the greatest generation are the young men fighting for us over in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're the greatest generation today.
Senator, did you want to?
Oh, I just say a 30-second close here. I think young people should recognize that if it's properly conducted, a career in politics, in government, can be one of our noblest professions. I honestly believe that. I thought for a while I might follow my father into the clergy. I think it probably was a break both for the Methodist Church and for me that I didn't do that. But I was a college professor for a while. I've done other things. In fact, I've been very lucky. I've never had a job since my teenage years that I didn't enjoy. So I've been very fortunate, none more so than the long years I've spent in politics. So don't let anybody discourage you. If you have ambitions to either run for office or to go into the civil service or the foreign service or whatever it is, give it a try. You may not make it, but you'll never know if you don't try. It's a dream worth pursuing, I think.
Well, Senator Dole on my right and Senator McGovern on my left. I know you have spoken tonight about the wisdom of consulting older people, and far be it from me to call either of you old folks, but you have certainly shared wisdom with us tonight, and we've been very appreciative, and we welcome you back anytime you can come to this area. Thank you both for a wonderful, enjoyable evening.